Welcome to Promoting Positive Behavior, Understanding Bullying, and Prevention Strategies.
Welcome to Understanding Bullying and Prevention Strategies. Bullying has become a hot topic in recent years and has become almost a buzzword among parents, educators, and even children. The phrase bullying is more likely to grab attention than saying so-and-so is being mean to me. It's important to know what defines bullying as opposed to kids sometimes being unkind to one another to really understand it and to get to the true root of the problem with bullying. Bullying is unwanted aggressive behavior that involves a real or perceived power imbalance and is repetitive. In order to be considered bullying, you need to remember that the behavior is aggressive and that, first of all, there's an imbalance of power, which means that the child who is bullying another child is using their power, such as physical strength or popularity, to control or harm the child who is being bullied. It also must be repeated more than once. There are three different types of bullying: verbal, social, and physical. Verbal bullying is saying or writing mean things. It can include name-calling, taunting, threatening a child, or teasing them. Social bullying, sometimes referred to as relational bullying, involves hurting somebody's reputation or relationships and can include leaving someone out on purpose, telling other children to not be friends with somebody or to not play with them, spreading rumors, or even embarrassing someone in front of the group. The third type is physical bullying, which involves hurting a person's body or their possessions. So this type of bullying could include hitting, kicking, tripping, pushing, spitting, or even taking or breaking someone's things. As you're learning about bullying in this course, it's very important to keep in mind that bullying will look different. It might look different in terms of it could be verbal bullying, social, or physical, or a combination of the three. It's also important to remember that in order to be considered bullying, the behavior must be aggressive and must include an imbalance of power and be repetitive.
We're going to start by looking at unmet needs, and the reason for this is because most negative or inappropriate behaviors that arise in kids arise out of a need that child doesn't have a better strategy for how to get that need met. So by understanding what some of the common needs of kids are as they develop, we can make sure that those needs are being addressed, and often that will diminish inappropriate or negative behaviors. We're going to look at developmental needs across three different age ranges. The first is pre and early elementary, and that's around 3 years old to around 6 years old. Then there's the elementary age range, which is 6 or 7 years old, and it goes up to around 10-ish years old. And then the middle school age range, which goes from around 11 up to around 14 or so years old. It's extremely important to remember that every child develops at a different rate. So just because a child is 9 years old and fits into that elementary age range doesn't necessarily mean that child isn't going to have some characteristics that are still at the pre or early elementary age, and or some characteristics that are already at that middle school age range. So each child is going to develop at different rates in different areas, and we need to notice the child rather than just focusing on the sort of typical developmental trajectory. So within each of these age ranges, we'll be taking a look at what some of the core developmental needs are that often arise in that age range, and what happens when those needs don't get met. First, let's take a look at that pre-elementary and early elementary age range. So in terms of developmental needs, what we see at this age range, the first thing that we see is the need to take initiative. This means that children in this age are starting to discover their own agency, which is their ability to do things and make decisions as an independent human being. And because of that, children in the pre-elementary and early elementary age range need lots of opportunities to make decisions or try things out or explore the things that make them interested or curious. We also have a need to feel purpose at this age. What that means is that children need to be allowed in this developmental age to discover and explore things that they focus on. So if a child is particularly interested in trying to open up a box or build a tower out of a certain kind of blocks. They'll set that purpose in their minds and oftentimes become very upset if they get pulled away from that task or that goal. And that's developmentally a very important thing to allow children to do, set those tasks or those goals for themselves and then work on accomplishing those purposes. Third, children at this age need a understanding of boundaries, but it can be difficult to develop that understanding without feeling hurt or wounded by boundaries being drawn or asserted by adults. So when a child is born, he or she doesn't have any understanding that the body in which that child exists is even separate from the body of the mother that brought the child to life. So one of the first things that infants learn is that their body is separate from the body of their parent or caregiver. And if they need something, they have to find a way to call attention to that need. From there, we develop a more and more sophisticated understanding of what it means to be a separate human being from other people and where the limits and requirements and boundaries are around how we interact with other people. From ranging from very simple concepts like mine, yours, and sharing to very, very sophisticated interpersonal and social norms and mores that vary from cultural group to cultural group and society to society. But at this young age, learning some of those more basic rules, like appropriate versus inappropriate touching, and how to share, and what mine really means, and what things are or are not owned by or possessed by a particular person, are very important skills, and different children are going to be at different places on that skill set based on what happens in the home as they're growing up. When we reinforce those boundaries, a lot of times children can feel rejected. And it's very important to find ways of reinforcing those boundaries without creating a sense of rejection. And the best way to do that is to think about those other two developmental needs, and instead of saying, no, that's not yours, or no, don't touch me like that, to encourage independence. Like, Sammy is playing with that toy right now. I want to see what you can do all by yourself with this toy. Or, I love that you want to give everybody kisses, but right now we're doing exercise time, so I want to see how fast you can run all by yourself. The fourth developmental need is a recognition of the influence of the family and home environment. So, at this age, children are only beginning to understand that different environments exist, and when they find themselves in an environment outside of the home environment, they're expecting it to work the same that the home environment works. So they're looking for sort of substitute or surrogate parent figures or caregiver figures, and they're looking for things to resemble their home environment as much as possible. When these developmental needs don't get met, some of the things that we see happening. The first is a loss of self-esteem or self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our belief in our ability to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. And that particularly links into those first two developmental needs. So if a child is not given opportunities to explore and discover and to try things on his or her own, and to find and experience that sense of self-driven purpose, a lot of times it causes that idea of being capable and of being a little explorer to sort of shut down. Another thing that can happen is beginning to doubt the sort of internal qualities of being love-worthy or having a right to happiness. These are things that we all need to believe. We need to believe that we're worthy of love and that we have a right to happiness. But children who are constantly sort of getting shut down and told that they're doing things wrong and that it's not okay, or who are getting boundaries reinforced in ways that feel really rejecting over and over and over again, can often end up feeling like they're just really not that lovable, or just really not good children. And that's very damaging. And when that starts to happen, a lot of times we start to see sort of acting out or aggressive behaviors that arise as a result of that self-perception of unworthiness or badness. Sometimes that's an attempt to sort of prove everybody wrong by sort of aggressively doing things that other kids have been praised or rewarded for, and maybe not understanding that it's not the appropriate time to do those things. And sometimes it's just more of a lashing out type behavior, so it can look different. but that acting out often arises as a result of those feelings of self doubt and unworthiness. And then sometimes at this age, particularly, especially if there's limited understanding of boundaries, behavioral issues will also arise because that lack of understanding of appropriate boundaries, and also maybe because of differences between expectations in the home environment and expectations in other environments, can lead to a lack of understanding about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. And then, as inappropriate behaviors arise, if they're not handled gently, that then can feed back into that sense of unworthiness or badness and sort of cause that downward behavioral spiral. If the core question or the key theme of the pre and early elementary age is, wow, what is this wonderful place? Like the imperative to explore and discover is at the heart of that early elementary and pre-elementary age group. At the elementary age group, the core developmental needs focus around a different question. And that question is, what am I good at? What can I do? Because self-efficacy and our perception of who we are and what we're good at starts to really get forged in this developmental stage. So consequently, kids in this age range really need to feel very good at accomplishing things. They need to feel like they're good at doing things. The sort of classic education environment, like a school environment, tends to put a great deal of emphasis on accomplishment in academics. And one of the benefits of informal education environments, like after-school programs for kids of this age, is that you can raise up other skill areas and emphasize the value of those other skill areas. So kids who are very artistic, very athletic, very creative, who have a really good sense of humor, who understand themselves or their peers really well, who are very musical. You can lift those talents up and build a sense of self-efficacy and pride in those kids. And that's really developmentally important. Another developmental need for this age is the need to take an idea and carry it all the way through to completion. This is sort of the next developmental step that follows that initial step from the earlier age range of needing to feel purpose, needing to set their own goals. At this age, children need to practice the process of starting with an idea and then figuring out how to make that idea into a reality, and then figuring out each of the individual steps and what order they go in, and then accomplishing those steps one at a time, because the neural pathways of the brain that we use in order to do that are getting forged at this age, and consequently having that experience again and again of doing that is very, very important. And that's part of why, in this age range, kids tend to get very, very upset if something doesn't get finished. So trying to make sure that you're both finding ways to scaffold activities so that there are multiple points of completion or accomplishment in an activity, and also trying to make sure that you are building in opportunities to figure out what the steps are to reaching a goal, are both very beneficial things to do. Another piece is focusing on the rules. The idea of fairness is very important at this age because morality is starting to form, which we'll talk about a bit later on this slide. So make sure that you're thinking very carefully about behavioral expectations or norms in your group or classroom, and identifying whether or not there are times that they're not being evenly or fairly applied. And if there are elements of unfairness, finding ways of explaining that. So for instance, saying each of us needs extra help in some things. For instance, I'm clumsy, so I need a little bit of extra help when we're doing something athletic. Some people in this group are really good at math and they don't need help with math, but other people need help with math. Some kids might need a little bit of extra help behaving appropriately during lineup time, so they might get a little extra support that other people don't need. But that's what we do here. We give each person the special kinds of help and support that they need. So taking the time to explain that concept rather than just saying, well, because that's the way it is, or because I said so, is very important to that developing morality. And in terms of environments, well, the family is still very important and the home is still very important. Children are now beginning to be able to differentiate between different relationships and different expectations in different environments. And so, as a result, the different relationships being forged in school and other community organizations and with other adults and with other peers become a little more important. And making sure that you place appropriate value on each of those different relationships is very beneficial because it helps children to develop robust social skills. When these developmental needs are not met, some issues that we see arising. First, because morality is developing, if a sense of fairness isn't clearly explained, that can feed into the feelings that might have been arising from the previous developmental stage around the idea of there being good children and bad children. And if a child does something inappropriate or makes a mistake or a bad decision, they're going to feel that they are a bad child because at this age it's still difficult to distinguish between a good decision and a good person. So helping to draw those distinctions, saying you're a good person and I really like you, even though just now you made a decision that I didn't like very much, can be very helpful. As morality is developing and therefore hopefully children are beginning to distinguish between good and bad decisions without necessarily having to feel like there are good and bad people, some kids, especially kids who are struggling, may start to feel inferior. And if that happens, then oftentimes, as a result of those feelings of inferiority, we'll see kids withdrawing emotionally and choosing not to engage with others or beginning bullying behaviors. And the reason that we often see that is because if a child feels like they're not really that good at anything important, if they feel inferior, if they feel like they're a bad kid because they get in trouble all the time and they're not really worthy of happiness or love, they don't feel empowered anywhere else in their lives. But what can happen is that a child might discover that they're good at bullying, and bullying might be the one thing that makes them feel empowered. So that's something we want to avoid at all costs by finding other ways of lifting up the talents and empowering the kids that we work with, particularly at this and older age ranges. So if at the pre-elementary and early elementary age, the kind of core question is, what is this crazy, wonderful place? How does the world work? And then the elementary age, the question becomes, who am I? How do I work? What am I good at? At middle school, we see a new question, and that question is, how do I fit? Um, where is my place? So it kind of merges the two former questions. The child has learned a lot about how the world works and a lot about how they work, and now they're saying, how do I put these two things together? What's my place in the world, in society, in the classroom, and so on? And this is a complicated question. It's a question most of us will grapple with to some extent for the rest of our lives. But this is the time at which that question is really first arising. And it's part of what makes that middle school age so difficult. Of course, another thing that makes it difficult is that kids in this age range are rapidly moving towards adolescence, which all by itself is a really complicated time to navigate, both physically and psychologically, as well as in terms of social emotional development and trajectory. So there are a lot of different developmental needs that arise out of this really complex question of how do I fit into the world. And the first thing that happens is that the level of empathy and awareness of what's happening in the world tends to escalate dramatically. It's somewhere in this age range. And how that looks is that it's not now just individual empathy, like I see that she's sad because I took her toy, but rather an awareness of sort of global injustices, that we fight wars over oil, or that most of the people in the prison system are lower income and minority people, and it's harder for women to get high-paying jobs than men, and disease is unfairly distributed across socioeconomic status rather, and so forth. So these senses of justice or injustice start to build into an idea that there's a lot of other people with a lot of other experiences all over the world. And as kids discover those global concerns or injustices, it's important that they become empowered and feel like they have a way of contributing. This is a great place to think about doing some project-based learning activities based on the concerns that are in the minds of the kids you work with. Another one, and this is a really core one, is the need to develop the sense of identity and a sense of the role in the world, the place where you fit in each of the different environments and groups that you find yourself in. What is my role in my family? What's my role at school? What's my role in my after school program? What's my role in sports teams? And the more different places in life that kids at this age have a sense that they have an important and meaningful place or role to play, the more of a solid sense of robust and mature identity will develop. So, finding ways of letting kids know how their individual talents and characteristics are valued in the environment or environments in which you see them is very helpful. In addition, empowerment becomes an increasingly significant need. And the reason for that is because, again, as kids begin to approach adolescence, increasingly they begin to start the process of feeling out what it's like to be in charge of yourself and being given opportunities to feel in control of their own lives and even to have a leadership role in the group or in the environment that they're in is very beneficial. But while that's going on, there's also individuation going on, and individuation is determining the ways in which you're different and separate from the group. And it's very important to teach each of the kids that you work with that the ways that they're different and separate from the group add to the group and enrich it, making it better and more complex and wonderful. A great example of this that I saw once was a teacher gave every child a red crayon and asked them to draw a picture of a garden. All the kids drew a picture of a garden, and then she gave out a full box of crayons to each group of kids, and they could use whatever colors they wanted, and they drew a second garden. And then they compared and contrasted the two gardens, and by and large agreed that the ones where they had access to all the crayons were much better. They were more interesting, more complex, and more realistic. And the teacher said, well, this is just like diversity in our classroom. This is just like the different things about each of us that are unique and unusual. Because those unique and unusual elements are what gives our classroom environment all of its richness and all of its complexity. So that kind of activity can really bring to light the idea that the individual qualities of each person are really valued. But you want to make sure you're living that truth, that every time that you have an opportunity to appreciate a unique individual characteristic of a child in your group, that you're appreciating it. Another developmental need is the need to forge strong peer relationships. At this age, peer relationships are becoming more important than authority relationships and family relationships. This too is in preparation for eventually becoming an adult and being responsible for yourself. This can be a really difficult stage of development for adults to manage because sometimes the ways in which kids want to be independent are ways that they're not ready to be independent yet. But understand that peer relationships are becoming more important and try to avoid putting yourself in situations where you're getting into power struggles with a child in front of peers because those are usually going to go really badly. And then lastly, puberty is beginning and social interactions are becoming increasingly complex, which we've already kind of discussed and we'll be discussing in a moment a bit more. So when these developmental needs aren't met, some of the core things that can arise. First of all, this developmental stage is sort of the first step towards becoming an adult, becoming independent, as we've been talking about. And so without a good combination of a lot of empowerment and opportunities for independence and leadership, but also a lot of support, kids can kind of flounder if there's not enough support or if there's too much rigidity and structure and not enough independence. Either one of those can very easily lead to aggressive behavior or a withdrawing or disengaging behavior. And it just depends on the kid and on the situation which of those two behaviors you'll see. Another thing to consider is that tweens, these kids that are sort of in the pre-teenage range, will often seek to get their emotional needs met by others. And that's actually a normal, healthy developmental step to take as well. But oftentimes at this age, they're turning more and more to peers to get their emotional needs met. And if they haven't learned healthy ways to communicate about their feelings and to get those needs met, then they'll turn to unsafe and unhealthy ways of doing that. So that's a potential risk factor. And then as kids struggle with these questions of dependence and independence and empowerment and identity and group environments and so forth, and as some kids withdraw or disengage and other kids become increasingly aggressive, you can see how this whole process, especially with those kids who are really feeling sort of stifled or are not receiving enough structure, can really lead to some bullying behavior. And as teasing and bullying become a part of what's happening in the peer group, um, the kids discover that if you laugh or join in when teasing or bullying is happening, you feel safe and powerful. And that feeds into that cycle of bullying and aggression.